My brother showed up drunk to my wedding and stopped the entire ceremony, and he was right. My brother Kweku smelled like whiskey and desperation when he pushed open the chapel doors at 2:14 in the afternoon, and the first thing I felt when I saw him stumble down the center aisle was not concern. It was fury. White, specific, embarrassing fury, the kind that lives in your jaw and your chest simultaneously and makes your hands grip whatever they're holding. I was holding a bouquet of white peonies. I held them tight enough that the stems bent. 112 people had turned in their seats to watch my brother walk toward the altar in a crumpled dress shirt with his tie loose and his eyes red, and every single one of those people was looking at me to see what I would do. And I was looking at my fiancé Dominic at the front of the chapel, and Dominic's face was doing something I could not read clearly from 20 feet away, but that I would think about many times in the months that followed. He looked for approximately 3 seconds, like someone who had been expecting a door to open and had expected it to be a different door. That expression lasted only 3 seconds. Then it resolved into the smooth, concerned performance of a man watching a chaotic situation and preparing to manage it. I did not understand what I was seeing. Not yet. I had been planning this wedding for 14 months when Kweku walked through those doors. The chapel was at a historic venue that charged what historic venues charge, which is to say an amount that had produced genuine calculation about what was worth keeping and what could be cut. The flowers were worth keeping. The photographer was worth keeping. The venue itself, with its arched windows and its late afternoon light, was worth every dollar because Dominic had wanted it specifically, and I had wanted Dominic to have what he wanted, because that was, I had come to understand over the 3 years we had been together, one of the primary organizing principles of our relationship. Dominic Farquhar was 36 years old, a commercial real estate developer, the kind of man who carried himself as though every room had been arranged for his arrival, which many rooms effectively had been because he was successful and polished and capable of a particular kind of charm that made people want to give him things. But he had been charming with me from the beginning. Specifically, deliberately charming in the way that some people are charming as a practice rather than a temperament. I had interpreted this as attention. I had been grateful for it. This is relevant to everything that followed. I want to be honest about my own participation in what I had constructed around myself, because the story is more useful that way. My brother Kweku was 32 years old, 4 years younger than me, and he had not liked Dominic from the first meeting. He had expressed this in the specific oblique way of a person who has learned that direct expression of this type of opinion produces conflict rather than reception. Small questions about Dominic's answers to things, observations delivered sideways. The particular silences that occur when someone disagrees but has calculated that speaking will cost more than staying quiet. I had interpreted his reservations as protectiveness, which is the most comfortable container for a sibling's concern when you are not ready to examine the concern itself. He had been more direct once, about 8 months before the wedding, when he called me from his apartment at 10:30 p.m. and said, "Adwoa, I need you to listen to me about something." I had listened in the specific way you listen when you have already decided the conversation is not going to change anything, which is to say, I had been present in body and defended in mind, and by the end of it, I had said something that contained the phrases you're reading into things, and Dominic and I are fine, and I need you to support this. And Kweku had gone quiet in the way he went quiet when he had said what he needed to say, and knew the room wasn't ready to hold it. He had supported the wedding, he had RSVP'd yes. He had shown up with his whiskey and his red eyes and his crumpled shirt, and he was wrong about every single surface thing and right about the one thing that mattered. He reached the front of the chapel and stood between me and Dominic, which required some navigation because the officiant, a man named Reverend Asare Boateng, had been standing in that space, and Reverend Asare Boateng stepped back with the controlled alarm of a man who had officiated many weddings and had occasionally encountered interruptions, but had perhaps not encountered this specific configuration. Kweku said, "I'm sorry." He said it to me, not to the room. And he was crying in the specific way that men who have been holding something for a long time cry when they finally stop holding it. Messy and immediate and without performance. He said, "I'm sorry I didn't say it better before. I'm sorry I said it the wrong way and made you defensive." He looked at Dominic then, and his expression changed from grief to something harder, and he said, "But I need her to know before she signs anything." I pulled my arm free from where it had been linked with my father's and stepped toward my brother. My father put his hand on my shoulder, and I stopped. The room was completely silent in the way that large rooms full of people go completely silent when something is happening that exceeds the framework they came prepared for. Dominic said, "Kweku, this isn't the place." He said it calmly. I'm in a tone I recognized as the one he used when he was managing a situation, not the one he used when he was caught off guard or frightened or guilty. Managing. I noted this and filed it without fully knowing what I was filing it under. Kweku said, "No, this is exactly the place." And then he said a name I had not heard before. He said, "Her name is Yolanda." He said, "She's been with him for 2 years." He said, "She thinks he's in New York at a conference." The silence that followed lasted approximately 5 seconds. I know because I counted them in the same way I count things when I need to impose structure on something I cannot control. The 5 seconds ended when Dominic's expression shifted. Not to shock, not to denial, but to the specific calibration of a man performing shock, which has slightly different timing than actual shock, and a slightly different configuration of the face, and which I would probably not have been able to identify before that moment, but which I identified immediately and completely. There it was. Not what Kweku had said, not the name, the face, the performed shock of a man who needed to play innocent for the room and was doing it 1 beat too late, with the eyes instead of the body, leaving the hands and the shoulders in the wrong position for genuine surprise. I had spent 3 years watching this man manage rooms full of people, and I knew what his performances looked like. This was one. I looked at my brother, who was crying and standing between us with his whiskey breath and his crumpled shirt and his specific grief, and I thought, he came here for me. He got drunk because he was frightened. He walked down the aisle in front of 112 people because he did not have another way to make me stop and hear him. And I thought, with the cold clarity of someone whose defense system has just been entirely overrun, he is telling the truth. What happened in the next 20 minutes is something I've described to several people, and that always produces a specific kind of silence when I describe it, the silence of people recalibrating what they thought the story was going to be. Dominic attempted to manage the situation. He spoke to the room in the smooth, measured tone of someone addressing a misunderstanding, using words like confusion and context, and something my brother clearly believes. And the performance was technically accomplished, and I watched it from 3 feet away and felt the bottom of a floor I had been standing on for 3 years give way. Not because of what he was saying, because of how he was saying it. I had been listening to Dominic manage things for 3 years, and I was, in that moment, outside it for the first time. Standing in my own wedding dress, watching a man I had planned to spend my life with perform sincerity for a room while my brother stood beside me with wet eyes and whiskey on his breath and the truth in his mouth. I put my hand on Kweku's arm. I said, quietly, "Do you have proof?" He pulled his phone from his pocket with a shaking hand and showed me a screenshot of a text message exchange between a contact saved as Y and a number I recognized as Dominic's because I had that number memorized the way you memorize the number of someone you have been with for 3 years. The last message in the exchange was time-stamped 11:47 p.m. the previous night. It said, "Tomorrow. Then I'm free. And then I'll explain everything." I looked at the screen for a long time. Then I looked at Dominic. I said, "Get out. My name is Adwoa Asante Birago. I am 36 years old, and I have never been more embarrassed in my life than I was in the hour after I told my fiancé to leave his own wedding." This is the part of the story that people sometimes skip past, because the drama of the revelation is more compelling than the specific texture of what follows it, but the texture is the honest part. 112 people had to be managed, gently redirected, given some form of account of what was happening without all the information being available. My mother was crying in a way that had several layers. Grief for the disrupted day, relief she was not yet ready to name, and the specific complicated emotion of a mother whose protective instincts have been activated by a situation she cannot fix. My father had his arm around Kweku, who had sat down in the front pew and was now sober in the way that people become sober very quickly when adrenaline overtakes alcohol. Yib staring at the floor of the chapel with his hands hanging between his knees. Reverend Asere Boateng had the expression of a man of God who had seen human nature in many configurations and had found, in this particular one, confirmation of something he had long suspected. He prayed quietly. I noticed this and found it, in a strange way, useful. Dominic had left. I do not know exactly when, because there was a period of approximately 10 minutes during which I was not tracking him at all, and when I looked for him, he was gone. The chapel doors were open, the late afternoon light was coming through in the specific amber way I had anticipated all day and paid a significant amount of money to access, and I stood in the front of the chapel in my dress and looked at the light and thought about the word tomorrow in a text message. My closest friend Beatrice, who had been my maid of honor and who had the specific quality of someone who converts crisis into action rather than paralysis, had the room cleared within 45 minutes in a way I still do not entirely understand, but that involved conversations she had with catering staff, the venue coordinator, and several of my aunts who responded to her direction with the alacrity of people who had been waiting for someone to tell them what to do. By 4 p.m., the chapel was empty except for me, Kweku, my parents, Beatrice, and a woman named Nana Opong, who had been my therapist for 2 years, and who had been invited to the wedding as a guest, and who sat quietly in the third row offering nothing unless I needed it. Which was exactly the right thing to do, and which I have thought about many times since as a model for how to be present in a crisis. My father was the first to speak after the room was cleared. He said, "Tell me exactly what you know." He said it to Kweku, who looked up from the pew and took a breath and told us everything. Kweku had discovered Yolanda through a mutual acquaintance who had seen Dominic in a restaurant 4 weeks earlier. A restaurant in a city he had told me he would not be visiting that week. A city Kweku happened to know I had checked his schedule against before approving a work conference overlap. The mutual acquaintance had mentioned it casually. The way people mention things they don't know are significant. And Kweku had not known what to do with it, and had sat on it for a week before doing what people who don't know what to do eventually do, which is look for more information. He had found Yolanda through a combination of social media and the specific forensic patience of a brother trying to build a case before he walked into another conversation where his sister would find a way not to hear him. What he found was a woman who had been in a relationship with Dominic for 2 years, who believed he was at a conference in New York, and who had no apparent knowledge of me. He had not contacted her. He had screenshots of her posts, which referenced weekend trips that matched trips Dominic had taken that he had described to me differently, and one post in particular from 6 months earlier. That showed Yolanda in a restaurant I recognized because Dominic had taken me to the same restaurant and told me it was his favorite and had implied, in the specific way he implied things, that it was connected to us. I looked at the screenshot Kweku showed me and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but that contained both and added something I can only describe as the specific nausea of a person discovering that the architecture of their life has been built on a foundation that was never what they thought it was. Nana Opong, who had been sitting quietly in the third row, asked if she could say something. I said yes. She said, "What do you need right now? Not what needs to happen, not what the next step is. What do you need right now, in this room?" I looked at her and thought about the question. And I said, "I need to know that my brother didn't ruin something real." She understood immediately what I meant. I needed to know that what I had lost was not the good thing I had believed it was, which was a different kind of grief than losing a good thing. She said, "From what I know and what you've just heard, it sounds like what you were about to sign was not the thing you thought it was, and losing something that was already false is not the same as losing something true." I sat with that for a while. I retained a lawyer 3 days after the wedding that wasn't. Her name was Philippa Darko. 18 years in civil law, with significant experience in fraud and financial dispute cases. Now referred by my father through a colleague who had used her in a business dispute and described her as someone who went into depositions the way other people went into arguments they expected to win. I retained her, not because I was certain I had grounds for legal action, but because I had been engaged to Dominic for 14 months, and during that engagement had made financial decisions that were connected to our planned joint future. I had terminated a lease on a flat I owned, I had declined a professional opportunity in another city, and I had contributed $22,000 to wedding expenses from personal savings, on the understanding that our finances were moving toward a shared structure. Philippa heard all of this in our first meeting, asked 12 specific questions, made notes in a yellow legal pad. RN said at the end, "We'll see what the financial entanglement looks like, but more importantly, I want to know what Dominic knew and when about the joint account discussions. You may have grounds that go beyond the emotional." I didn't know what she meant yet. I was about to find out. The first piece of formal documentation arrived through Philippa 3 weeks after our initial meeting. She had requested, through the formal discovery process that preceded a potential civil claim, records of the joint account that Dominic and I had been in the process of establishing in the 6 months before the wedding. The account had not yet been fully formalized. We had been in the process, as the documents showed, of transferring certain assets. What the documents also showed, and what Philippa brought to my attention at our second meeting with the specific care of someone delivering information they know will land with weight, was that Dominic had submitted documentation to the financial institution that contained information about my assets and financial standing that I had shared with him in the context of our private financial planning conversations. The documentation had been submitted as part of a separate application that had nothing to do with our joint account, an application made by Dominic in his personal capacity for a credit facility in which he had represented certain information about projected shared assets in a way that was, at minimum, misleading, and that Philippa said with notable restraint she considered potentially fraudulent. When I sat across from her desk and thought about a man who had been managing rooms for 3 years and asked her, "How long has he been doing this?" She said, "The application was filed 11 months ago, 14 months before your wedding." She paused. "Which means approximately when you got engaged." The second professional involved in what I had begun privately calling the architecture of what actually happened was Detective Constable Amma Frempong, 11 years in financial crimes, who came into the picture 6 weeks after the wedding through a referral from Philippa after the financial documentation was reviewed by a forensic accountant. Detective Frempong had the quality of someone who found patterns satisfying in the specific way that people who are good at their work find the work satisfying. And she brought to our first meeting a clarity about what she had seen in the financial documents that was both useful and slightly vertiginous, the way accurate information often is when you have been operating without it. She confirmed that the credit application was fraudulent in its representation of shared assets, and said that this, combined with additional documentation her team was reviewing, suggested a pattern of financial conduct that went beyond one application. She said, "There are at least 2 other instances in the past 4 years. Different individuals, the same approach." She said this in the measured tone of a professional presenting findings, and I received it the way you receive information that confirms the shape of something you had been starting to understand. Not with surprise, exactly, but with the specific cold recognition of a thing falling into place. Different individuals, the same approach. I was not the first person Dominic had done this to. I was, as best Detective Frempong could establish, the third. The crisis that I had been bracing for came not from the legal process, but from a Thursday morning phone call from a woman I had not spoken to and had been deliberately not thinking about, Yolanda. She had found my number through Beatrice, who had given it with my permission because I had decided, at some point between the wedding and that Thursday, that I needed to know what Yolanda knew rather than operating on assumptions about it. She called at 9:15 a.m., and her voice had the quality of someone who had been prepared to leave a voicemail and had been caught off guard by an answer. And she said, "I wasn't sure you'd pick up." I said, "I almost didn't." She said, "I want you to know that I didn't know." I said, "I believe you." She said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say this." She paused. "He asked me to marry him 2 months ago in New York, which was the conference he was supposedly at." I held the phone and looked at the wall of my kitchen. She said, I said yes. I said, "I know. I didn't know this exactly, but I knew the shape of it. The same shape I had been holding for 6 weeks, the shape of a man who had been running 2 relationships towards simultaneous formal conclusions, managing both the way he managed rooms with the smooth confidence of someone who believed the performances would never overlap. Except Kweku had walked into the chapel in his crumpled shirt, and they had overlapped. She said, "I have his ring." And I said, "So do I." And we both were quiet with that for a moment, 2 women on a phone call in the middle of an ordinary Thursday, each holding a ring from the same man, both of whom had believed the ring meant what rings are supposed to mean. Dominic was charged formally 8 weeks after the wedding, with 1 count of fraud and 2 counts of obtaining financial benefit through misrepresentation, which were charges connected to the credit facility application, and a second application Detective Frempong's team had identified, unrelated to me, involving a woman named Kofi Mensah who had been in a relationship with him 4 years prior and who had agreed to provide a formal statement to the investigators. The charges did not include anything connected to his simultaneous romantic relationships. This is a function of how the law works, which does not criminalize the kind of betrayal that most people consider the most significant part of the story, but does criminalize using that betrayal as a financial vehicle. Philippa filed the civil claim alongside the criminal process, seeking recovery of the $22,000 I had contributed to wedding expenses and the additional financial losses connected to the asset documentation used in the credit application. The process was ongoing at the point where the most significant events I am describing concluded, and I will return to its resolution in a moment. What I want to describe first is the conversation with Kweku, which happened 3 weeks after the wedding. In my parents' kitchen on a Saturday afternoon where my mother had made food. No one was quite hungry enough to eat, and everyone was eating anyway, because eating was something to do with your hands. Kweku and I sat at the kitchen table after our parents went to the other room, and I said, "Tell me how long you knew." He said, 4 weeks before the wedding. I said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" He looked at the table. He said, "I tried to tell you 8 months ago, and you shut it down in less than 5 minutes. I said, "I know." He said, "I didn't have proof then, just a feeling and some questions that didn't add up, and you needed proof. You needed something I could show you." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have found the proof sooner." I said, "You found it when you found it." He said, "I almost didn't come." I said, "What?" He said, "The morning of." When I had the screenshots, I was sitting in my car outside the chapel. I thought about calling you. He looked up. I thought, if I walk in there, she'll never forgive me. And then I thought, if I don't walk in there, she'll spend her life with someone I know is lying to her. I said, "And you got drunk?" He almost smiled. He said, "I had 4 hours between when I parked and when the ceremony started. I didn't do anything useful with them." I said, "You walked through those doors?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "That was the useful thing." He put his hands over his face, and his shoulders shook for a moment, and I reached across the table and put my hand on his arm, and we sat like that for a while in my parents' kitchen with the food going cold. And I thought about what it costs a person to walk down an aisle in front of 100 people with whiskey on his breath and grief on his face, because he could not think of another way to make his sister hear him. Some debts don't have an adequate accounting. The civil claim resolved 7 months after Philippa filed it through a settlement negotiated outside of court in a process that Philippa described to me over the phone in a tone that I recognized as professional satisfaction barely contained. The settlement included recovery of the $22,000 in wedding expenses, recovery of additional amounts connected to the asset documentation, and a confidentiality provision that I negotiated the terms of personally, because I had specific views about what information should and should not be bound by confidentiality that Philippa respected, while making clear that my views were unusual in this context and that she supported them. The criminal process took longer and was still moving through its stages as of the point where I am writing this, which I mention because I believe in accounting accurately for where things actually stand rather than wrapping situations in conclusions they have not yet reached. What I can say is that the evidence Detective Frempong's team assembled was comprehensive, that Kofi Mensah's statement was strong, and that Yolanda had agreed to provide a supporting statement about the second engagement, which she described as making her feel less alone in a situation that had been constructed specifically to isolate everyone in it. She said this to me on a phone call, not to any official. I wrote it in a notebook I was keeping at the time. I've thought about it often. Nana Opong and I continued working together through the following year, not exclusively on what had happened, but on the structural question of how it had been possible. How I had spent 3 years with someone and had been so invested in the performance that I had trained myself to receive my own brother's concern as interference. She did not frame this as my fault, which I appreciated, but she also did not frame it as entirely external to me, which I appreciated more. She said in one session, by something that I have kept because it has proven to be the most accurate single sentence about the experience: "The people who manage us most effectively are the people who understand what we most want to believe." Dominic had understood what I wanted to believe, which was that I had found a person who matched my ambition and my care and my need for a specific kind of solidity in a relationship, and he had performed that person with enough accuracy and enough consistency for long enough that my investment in the performance became a form of protection for it. I had protected a lie by calling my brother's concern overprotectiveness. I had given a man I was going to marry information about my assets while telling myself that trust required exactly that. I had ignored the managed quality of Dominic's expressions because managing expressions was something he was good at, and I had decided that competence was a form of character. These were errors I had made. I own them. They do not change what Dominic did, but they are part of the honest account of what happened to me, and I am not interested in telling the story without them. My brother got married himself. 14 months after my wedding, that wasn't. He married a woman named Efua, who is a secondary school teacher and who brings food to family gatherings in quantities that suggest she has been doing this for other families for most of her life and has simply extended the practice. At the wedding, which was small and specific and exactly right for the people involved, Kweku gave a speech at the reception that did not mention anything about the previous 14 months, except at the very end, where he looked at me across the room and said, "I've learned that the most important things are not always the easiest things to say, and that saying them late is better than not saying them at all." His new wife Ifwa nodded beside him like someone who had heard this before and had formed the opinion that it was true. I raised my glass and thought about a crumpled dress shirt in a chapel doorway, and a man who got drunk in a parking lot for 4 hours because he loved his sister and couldn't think of a better way in. There is no better way, sometimes. There is only showing up with what you have and hoping it's enough. He showed up. It was. The rest? All of it. The lawsuit, the charges, the settlement, and on the long year of Nana Opong's questions and my own, the rest was consequence. But the beginning was my brother walking down an aisle in front of everyone, choosing me over the easier silence, and being right about the one thing that mattered. I didn't need to hurt Dominic. The truth did it for me. But the truth only got in the room because Kweku opened the door.